Welcome back. And surprise, I'm the lecturer for tonight. So let me tell you the story about when Casey and I sat and came up with the topics for this series. We wanted to include this one because everyone always asks about this one. And then we came up with a list of potential speakers, and we had someone in mind. That person couldn't do it, but we're like, we've got all these other speakers, these people we went to, every single one of them could not do it tonight. And so late last week, we were like, one of us is gonna do it. And then I drew the short straw. Yes, I am awesome at this. And the funny story, and so this is gonna lead into tonight's topic, because my thought, and this is what I do with everything, is I know who the reputable scholars are. I'll just find someone who's written a book. I'll read a book over the weekend, and then that'll be the basis of my... So what I discovered is no reputable scholar has written a book specifically on Jewish numerology. Now, for a couple of different reasons, I also discovered that a whole lot of crazy people have written books on numerology. And that's part of what I want to kind of unpack tonight, because what we're going to be talking about tonight is the importance that numbers hold in the Bible. And the thing is, for the people who wrote the Bible, numbers held a very deep significance, and that is not made up, that is not invented, that is historically documented. All of those reputable scholars, within their lectures, they'll mention this. Like within my seminary lectures, I went to Duke. Duke is not a conspiracy theorist kind of seminary. They talk about the historical importance of numbers for the writers of the Bible and what they might have been trying to communicate in the use of different numbers. And so that is absolutely legitimate. Now, you can take that nugget and run with it. And if you Google, as I have, Jewish numerology, the first 100 books you come up with are all about conspiracy theories about a secret code that's hidden in the Bible that's going to tell us something about the Antichrist or when Jesus is coming back. Or you hear about astrology, or you hear about other things. And so what happens is I think people go to extremes with this, and they either shy away from it completely, or they just go whole hog into a conspiracy theory that every single number in the Bible is a secret code for something. And so what I'm going to try to do this evening is I'm going to try to split the difference, because I don't think either one of those extremes is actually accurate. I don't think either one of those extremes takes the Bible and what we know about history seriously. And so what I want to try to unpack for you is what we know, what we can be assured of, and maybe open up some potential. I think there's probably more to numbers than I'm going to talk about tonight, but I want to introduce to you what we know about what the biblical writers would have intended with their use of numbers in the text that we have. So we're starting, this is obviously a course on a series on Judaism. We're starting with the Jewish understanding of numbers, and then we get to play with what Christians did with it, because that's a whole lot of fun. So Christians took all the Jewish symbolism, and then they got played with and made into something different, but something that kind of reflected the old thing. And they did it with all kinds of symbolism, but also with the numbers. So what we're going to be talking about are fundamentally two different topics. The first is that there were numbers that had inherent symbolic significance for the writers of the Bible. And so when these writers were writing, the same way a good writer might employ any kind of symbolism to deepen their message, a writer of the Bible might have intentionally used some variation of an intentional number in order to deepen their message. It doesn't mean that they're putting a secret code in there. It means that they're, in this painting that they're painting, they're adding a little bit of shading over here to deepen and enhance the message. So I do think one of our grounding rules, guidelines, is when we look at the numbers in the Bible and we try to interpret them, do they go along with the message of the rest of the book? Or do they appear like a secret code that's like hidden in there? Because if it completely contradicts the message of the rest of the author is writing, it probably wasn't something the author actually intended to put in there, right? However, if it supports and enhances the message of the rest of the book, then it's entirely possible that the author added that in as an extra flavor just to enhance the portrait he was painting. We're going to talk about, because I'm staying on real solid ground here, we are not getting wild and crazy tonight, folks. We're talking about 7, 12, and 40 and derivatives thereof. There are, of course, other significant numbers. I don't think any compare to these three, and we're going to talk about these three in depth. One of the earliest scholarly books that was written was called Number in the Bible, and he does make an argument that 1 through 10 can all have their own significance. And I read through it, and you can find, this is one, if you Google it, if you, in fact, you found a webpage, we can send that one out. And it was the significance of 1 through 10. And I don't think they're necessarily bad. I just think some of them are a little bit common sense. Like the 4 stood for the 4 corners of the earth, which would mean universality. The 2 would stand for just kind of the dualism of dual natures of man and woman, or something like that. They didn't necessarily seem specifically Jewish or Christian. These, although these are not only acknowledged by Jewish and Christian religions, have a special significance within both Judaism and Christianity. And there's a word on that. You look at every other major religion, and they also have a numerology. And I don't know if one of you wants to come up with a theory about what's going on there, along with all those crazy people on the internet, we can do that. But I did not look into anything but Judaism and Christianity. So don't ask me about Hinduism, because I don't know. But I do know enough to know that we're not the only ones who've seen special things about 7, 12, 40. I do want to pause here and just give you guys a brief anecdote, because while I was preparing this, it got me thinking about an interaction I had when I was in seminary at Duke. Now, as a background to this, I'm a very, very verbal person. I took mathematics because I had to, because they would not let me out of college if I didn't pass the math courses. I'm a very verbal person. I always have been. In my calculus class in high school, I wrote poetry in the margins. That's how verbal I am. And so to me, the Bible has always been the gateway to God, because it's words, right? Words are how I get to everything. Words are how I understand the world. I'm very, very verbal. I had a fascinating interaction at Duke with a graduate student. I don't actually remember what he was a graduate student what he was a graduate student in, but he was not a verbal person, he was a math person. And he told me that he became a theist, not a Christian, a theist, because of the math he saw in nature. And he said it's just not a coincidence when you look at the flower spiral and the seashell spiral and the galaxy spiral, and they're all the same. When you start unpacking how many mathematical realities there are in the universe, you have to believe that there's a mind behind it somewhere. And for him, math, numbers, were his gateway to God. And it was fascinating because I don't work that way. And he was not yet a Christian, but he had talked himself into theism because he could not believe in a meaningless universe, seeing the universe we live in and believing it completely meaningless. I think that kind of approach is somewhat behind the reason that numbers have significance, both within our scriptures and within the religions of the world. I think that there is probably something universal to the number 7 and the number 12. We're going to be talking about what role they play in the Bible. But I think, people who approach the world mathematically will see a part of the personality of God that I don't, because I'm a verbal person. But it doesn't mean it's not real. So I just wanted to put that in the back of your brains as we're moving ahead. Okay, so this is the first half of the topic. The second half of the topic is not just numbers with spiritual significance, but actually using numbers to spell words and words to spell numbers within the Bible, which is called gematria. Gematria was a common ancient practice because before there were numerals, every letter was assigned a numeric value. So the way you would write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 100, 200, 500 was by using letters in a particular order. And once the letter became associated with a number, if you're an author, you've just got a whole new tool in front of you, right? So all of a sudden you can throw in double entendre, triple entendre, because you have that tool available to you. And we know this was a practice because in other contemporary literature of the time, we see authors doing it and explaining what they're doing. That this word symbolizes this because these letters add up to this number, yada, yada, yada. And so we know it wasn't, not everyone did it, but we know it was a common practice of the time. However, you can see where people can go crazy with this, right? Because every letter is a number. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the instances we are pretty sure this appears in the Bible, and then how we vet whether or not that's what the author was intending or not. Okay, so I'm going to start with 7. 7, the most often used number in the Bible. It also appears first. I mean, unless we're talking about, on day 1. But like the first important number is 7 because this is the 7 days of creation. It symbolizes overwhelmingly, if you look across the scriptures, completion, perfection, completion of man, completion of creation. Again, the Jewish people were not the only ones to recognize this. This is universal throughout many, many different faiths, especially of the ancient Near East. Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher, wrote on the creation of the world, "I doubt whether anyone could adequately celebrate the properties of the number 7, for they are beyond words." 7 appears so many times I can't list it all. Not in the Bible, in just kind of Jewish thought, there were 7 stages to a person's life, there were 7 classes of angels, there were 7 parts to heaven. There were 777 just kind of everywhere. It was the number of spiritual perfection. And then within the Bible, you have 7 everywhere also. There's the 7 days of creation, the Joseph story, where Joseph is sold into slavery and then becomes head, partner to Pharaoh in Egypt. 7 keeps getting repeated in his story also. 7 candlesticks in the tabernacle. You can Google this and get all the references. Lots and lots of 7, and it's always perfection, completion. 7 would be considered the number of God. It's divine perfection. And if you look back to specifically how the authors of Genesis would have used it, think about that first 7 days. This was the world as it was supposed to be. This was creation as it was supposed to be. And God did everything God needed to do in those 7 days. So what do we do with 7? If 7 is a number of perfection, then you can play with that mathematically. So 7 minus 1 equals 6. So if 7 is perfection, then 6 becomes a number that symbolizes eternal imperfection. Something that's never quite living up to perfection. So the most famous reference to that would be Revelation 13, where we have the number 666. And we'll talk about that later because there's a couple different things that could mean. But one of the possible interpretations of that is if 777 is perfect, then if we're going to have a number that describes the opposite of perfect, we're going to do 666. Another one, 7 times 2, be 14, which is perfect doubled, more perfect. One possible, and I'm going to say possible a lot because we don't actually know, but like possible instance of that would be Matthew's genealogy. So if any of you were here when I preached this was I think 2 Advents ago, I was preaching on the genealogy of Matthew. And what he does is he divides up his genealogy to get to Jesus, 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. Now, what's interesting about that is if you go back and look at the generations, there were not exactly 14. He had to fudge some generations to make it 14, 14, 14. And that's a clue to us that he wanted to play with the numbers, right? Because obviously he knew what they were, and obviously all of his readers would have known what they were. He wanted to play with the numbers, and he draws attention to the fact that he was doing 14, 14, 14. I think that is one of the clues to us that he is employing some kind of symbolism, and we should look at what he's doing. One option is the 14, 14, 14 is double 7, and he's trying to imply this divinity within the lineage of Christ. There are other options for interpreting that, but if we're going to look at places in the Bible where it's possible that numbers mean more than they say, when an author intentionally kind of fudges something and then draws attention to the number, I think that's a clue to us that the number is supposed to mean something. And so that would be one way of interpreting that. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of everything that's a multiple of 7. So 7, sevenfold, 7 times 7, 70 times 7. All of those that appear in the scripture would be a reference back to this. Now, interestingly, this is my favorite iteration of 7. What Christians did with it was 7 plus 1. If 7 was the days of the creation, then 8 is the first day of the new creation. So then 8 becomes the number of Jesus, because 8 is you've gotten through the 7th day, you've gotten through the Sabbath, and the day of resurrection, the first day becomes 8. And that is why baptismal fonts have 8 sides. So when you look in Christian architecture, not everyone, but traditional baptismal fonts will have 8 sides as a reference to the 8th day. And every time you see the 8th day referenced in early Christian literature, it's drawing on this 7 plus 1. And in fact, if you look at our baptismal font, it has 8 sides also. It's deeply rooted in Christian history. Okay, so let's talk about 12. 12 symbolizes good human government under God. And there's lots of instances of this. Again, this all goes back to Genesis. Every important number we have starts in Genesis and is developed from there. So Ishmael has 12 sons. Jacob has 12 sons. 12 sons become 12 tribes. There are 12 months in the normal Jewish year, 12 disciples. Most of the iterations of 12 that you see across the Old Testament are referenced back to the 12 tribes. So there's lots of times where you'll see someone sending 12 messengers. It's because it's one to each tribe. Or lots of times where you'll see someone, I don't know, there's like 12 divisions or 12, 12 portions, and it's because it's supposed to be one for each tribe. Like the fundamental reference is the 12 tribes of Israel, which is God's kind of chosen way of leading on the earth. And then we have that develop in the New Testament when the 12 disciples take on leadership roles, and we have this image in Revelation of there being 12 thrones to judge the nations. And so it's this image of human stewardship done right. Human dominion's a negative word, but imagine dominion wasn't a negative word. Human leadership done right. That's what the number 12 symbolizes. And then when you get into Revelation, because Revelation deals so heavily with government and leadership, there are 12s all over the book. Like I couldn't even list them all. So then the way you play with the number 12, if 12 is the number of good government, you get to play with that mathematically too. So one of the most interesting things I found when researching this particular talk, 12 minus 1 is 11. Throughout the book of Judges, the number 11 and its multipliers are repeated. I didn't know that. I've read the book of Judges a lot. But what I just kind of read numbers at their face value because I'm from a mindset where I read numbers at their face value. But the entire premise of the book of Judges is, so the first sentence is, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then all hell broke loose, right? That's the entire book, is as things get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then the last sentence, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so the whole book is a story of humans getting it wrong. And within that, when they mention populations, or when they mention sizes of groups, over and over and over again, you have 11 and multipliers of 11 and derivatives of 11. And that's kind of interesting. So that's the kind of thing where if you don't know that, you can still read the book and get it. But if you do know that, it does seem a little bit intentional, right? It does seem that the author is trying to drive his point home in one more way, that humans can't lead well on their own without God. And then on the other side of that, human leadership under God done well, the most obvious example of that would be Revelation, where we have these visions of the 24, which is 12 times 2, elders gathered around the throne. You have the 12 apostles judging the nations. You have the 144,000, which is 12 times 12,000. These people love mathematics, right? So everything that's a multiplier of 12 then comes back to this. Yeah.
I'm just curious because I've always heard of one is God. So I'd never thought of this before, but looking at the number 12 minus 1, a government of mankind absent God is evil.
Yeah. Yes.
Good job.
Yeah, and you do have to. Our Arab. No. You're right. You're absolutely right. A government of mankind the point would be absolutely apt. Just make sure that you're not. Our Arabic numerals would not have been introduced until much later, and so they wouldn't like this kind of 12 minus 1 equals 1 1. Like that's not how they would have conceived of it. But the concept of 12 minus God, I think that concept absolutely stands. I haven't asked for questions. Do you have any?
Yeah,
I just kind of kept going.
I was going to ask about
Yeah.
Perfection.
Yeah? You want to go back here?
How do they, how was that, how was the number 7 defined as perfection?
So there is no place where the biblical authors give us their definitions. They assume we know them. What we are describing is how they're using it. And so perfection is a word that we are using to describe their use of describing God, basically. And I mean, we could use other words. This would have been a lot easier if they'd given us a dictionary. But they also just kind of assumed everyone knew it, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing, these texts are so old, a lot of these they would assume everybody would just know, would just get. The same way I would assume you guys would get that black is a symbol of darkness, red is a symbol of blood, green is a symbol of new life. I wouldn't explain that to any of you. And I wouldn't put it in a dictionary because I would expect you to get it. That's kind of how they saw this. Okay. 40. 40 also initially appears in Genesis, goes throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Now, one of the things about, and there's a million 40s. I love this. One writer compared it to the phrase umpteen, right? There's umpteen days, there's 40 days. It's enough time, but it's also specifically associated with trial and testing. So the flood is the first one. The spies search Canaan for 40 days. Israel in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses is on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus is in the wilderness 40 days. There's a whole lot of 40s, and it's all that, are you going to come out of this with commendation or with judgment on the other side of it? What was interesting about 40 is that unlike the other numbers, I at least don't find in the Bible instances of where it gets played with. So in all these other ones, in the 7, you have the 7 minus 1, the 7 plus 1. The 12, you've got the same thing. I don't see that with 40. There's not a whole lot of 39s. There's not a whole lot of 41s. There is a little bit of 80, which is 40 times 2. But when I looked at the instances of that, it didn't really seem necessarily that significant. And there's not like, it's not like our altar has 40 sides on it, within Christian symbolism. So it does seem that 40 kind of stayed 40. We took it and we turned it into the 40 days of Lent. But I don't see much variation on that. And if any of you know of any variations, I'm happy to be proven wrong on that. Okay, so let's talk about gematria. So this is, in ancient languages, letters were assigned numerical values. And this was before numerals became common and popular. This was how they would write numbers. A had 1, B had 2, et cetera, et cetera. Because of that, it was just an obvious way for authors to throw in another meaning. We know it was a practice because we have contemporary works in which the author explains what he's doing. We don't know for sure how much of the Bible has this. And this is one of those things where when you get to heaven, you can ask Jesus how much of the Bible has this in it. Because, if an author is listing off populations or years or something else, maybe there's significance there. Or maybe that was just the population of the time. It's kind of like when I was reading John, when I preached on John, and they did the catch of fish, and there were 153 fish in the net. And you have to be like, that was a weird detail, John, for you to put in. And the answer might just be there was 153 fish in the net, right? Like you can write a whole book on what it could be, but it might just be like that was the number. So we're never going to know for sure. But our clues, first of all, there are usually internal clues that the author is playing with numbers for thematic purposes. They usually tell, like Matthew draws attention to the 14, 14, 14. A lot of the times, Revelation that we're going to see draws attention to its numbers. A lot of the times the author will tell you to pay attention to the numbers if you're supposed to pay attention to the numbers. And the second, if the message of the supposed gematria is consistent with the message of the rest of the book, maybe it's there. Okay, so let's look at 2 of the most obvious examples. And one, so I mentioned the genealogy of Matthew, the 14, 14, 14. And so one possible interpretation is that he was saying divine, divine, divine. 7 times 2, 3 times over. There's another possible interpretation, because 14 is the numerical value of David. In Matthew's entire premise, remember Matthew is writing to a Jewish Christian audience. His entire premise is to announce Jesus is the son of David and make an argument that Jesus is the son of David. And so it would be fitting within the context of that book for him to start basically by saying 3 times over, David, David, David. And to the audience to whom he was writing, that might have been more powerful than him just getting the genealogy historically correct, right? Because he's not just trying to give a genealogy, he's trying to send a message. And so that is one of the places where I think we could legitimately say maybe. Like this is a maybe on what he was doing here. The other one is Revelation 13. And we've also talked about this with the 666. What's fascinating about the 666, so for the context, Revelation is an apocalypse. An apocalypse is a genre of literature that draws heavily on symbolism to communicate what it's trying to communicate. It often has a lot of prophecy in it. It often has a lot of kind of over-the-top images. It often has a lot of end times, eschatological talk in it. And oftentimes it speaks both to its immediate context, but also contains universal themes that are applicable to every context, which is why it's then included in the Christian canon. Revelation 13, there is a whole lot about political persecution under the Roman Empire. There's a whole lot about the churches being persecuted and standing strong during persecution. And in this particular instance, there is a beast that comes up that has a mortal wound, but then recovers. And the number of the beast is given as 666. Fascinating. There are manuscripts that were discovered that say 616. You're going to have to change your tattoo now, right? I'm just kidding. So there's 666, there's 616. Both of those manuscripts date from about the same time. So the going theory is Nero or Neron would fit both of them, and would be contemporary for the time, and would be applicable to the theme, and would be someone that Christians at the time really would have thought was the beast, right? And so emperor, his proper name was Neron with an N at the end. That would have been 666. If you take that off and change it to Nero, it would be 616, and that would explain both of the manuscripts. And again, that's one of those things where if you read Revelation, he very obviously says, pay attention to the numbers, right? It's obvious he's trying to do something symbolic with the numbers, the same way he's trying to do something symbolic with quite a lot of the book. And so that would be, I wouldn't stand up here and say, absolutely, that's what it means. But that would be a place where I think we could interpret that. It would support the theme of the rest of the book. It'd be historically viable. And it would help our understanding of what the rest of the book means. Now, there very well may be lots of other instances of gematria. Now that you know what it is, I think you can probably do the research on your own to do some homework about what's legit, what's not legit, what enhances our understanding of the book, what sends us into crazy town, and then everything in between. But I do think we have to acknowledge that it's there, because if we don't, then we're just going to think Matthew got it wrong, right? We're just going to think like Matthew didn't read the Old Testament, or the writer of Revelation just it was making up numbers. Okay, so that's roughly the bulk of our content for tonight. Thoughts, questions? What are you curious about? Yes, ma'am.
Numbers in relationship to the written word. The ancient alphabets, like Minoan and some of these original ones, were actually originally scribbles for keeping accounting.
Yes.
So at the very beginning, there was that number relationship.
Yes. I'm thinking primarily of ancient Greek and Hebrew. Right, so there are, if you're looking at numerology within other ancient Near Eastern religions, there's a whole lot I don't know there. But you're right, there are some languages that develop numerals.
But could ancient Hebrew or whatever was a precursor to ancient Hebrew started that way, and they just kept on with a significance of numbers?
I don't know the answer to that question. I have no idea. Maybe. I mean, there's also just kind of like the universal. I mean, one of the numbers I didn't talk about was 3, but like every society, even if they didn't know what a prime number was, knew that 3 was a prime number, and this was the first kind of special number that we have. And so 3 holds a significance. 7 is the same kind of way, holds a significance because of, math has always been around. So I don't know anything about the evolution of the Hebrew manuscript. That would be a fascinating thing to ask. The guy who's coming next week is actually a professor of, he's a New Testament professor, but he does a whole lot of Old Testament work, and he might know.
I read a book by John learning rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
And it is mysteries of prophetic, or the prophetic mysteries, I think it is.
Okay.
And it was all about, it was so far over my head.
Yeah.
It was all about substituting numbers and letters and having them work together in the Hebrew alphabet with the Bible. And he was talking each seven. I've listened to it and I've gone back and
Yeah.
listened to it, and it's still,
Yeah.
it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
It just, he tells what letters and what numbers represent words and how you get there. And I took notes and I was going, okay, I'm throwing them all away.
Well,
I get it.
and on that note, I do think that we're not going to find anything from numerology that we can't find in the text otherwise. I think the themes are all, if we find a text through numerology that is not explicit in other themes of the Bible, it's probably not actually there. It's probably made up. I think numerology enhances the themes, but I don't think it invents new themes that aren't in the Bible somewhere else.
He just was putting in how the Hebrew language intersects with the Bible. Is how
Yes.
that particular book.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I like his books.
Yeah.
Good author.
That's great. Other questions? Yes, sir.
How about Friday the 13th?
That wasn't ours. I don't think that was ours, was it?
Any Bible references? I've read 2 Bible references.
What? So what do you think?
It's not what I think.
Yeah, or what's?
Just giving you the
Yeah.
information. So one is Judas was the 13th person at the Last Supper.
Oh,
So
12
that's
disciples
one
plus
of the
one, yeah.
hypothesis behind it. There's also one about Cain killing Abel.
but what would be the 13? So I have heard 13 as a number of imperfection, of unrighteousness in the Bible. But what's the 13th reference with Cain killing Abel?
I just saw it.
I do think,
There are a lot of lucky number 13.
yeah, I do think.
This is the unlucky part of it.
From what I read, 13 is overwhelmingly understood to be a negative number in the Bible. When I looked at the references, it didn't look super convincing to me, but I also haven't spent a ton of time, and I have no idea where Friday the 13th came from. Because then why would it be Friday? Why would it be Friday? Is that a reference to Good Friday?
Uh-oh. That would be my guess. Anyway, that's the origin.
Yeah.
They say they can't pinpoint it, but that's one of the hypotheses. So
I was reading Mr. Google.
Yeah? What does Google say?
Who could be?
you never know.
It says, for Jews, 13 has been a symbol of strength and sometimes even good luck. For example, when Israel was established in 1948, but this is modern.
Yeah.
The first provisional government had 13 members. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't.
Well, most
I don't know.
office buildings omit before 13.
Yeah,
right.
So we are very superstitious people. I do not know the origins. I know the origins of some of our superstitions, but not all of them.
St. Luke's Hospital, the 13th floor has the air conditioning.
Oh, that's funny.
There are no patients.
Yes, 80% of buildings don't have a 13th floor. If they
Listed.
have it. Yeah.
Question about,
Yeah.
what about going, is numerology the, whatever you want to call it, the science or the hex or
Science is a real strong word for this.
Right.
Um,
Has that come out of ancient texts as well?
Wait, what are you talking about?
Numerology,
Like today's numerology?
yes.
Yeah. I mean, so this is what you'll get. If you Google numerology, you will get a whole lot of people who see a whole lot of things. And they look at the Hebrew scriptures, they look at other ancient Near Eastern texts, they look at astrology, they look at a whole lot of stuff. I don't know enough to have an educated opinion. All I know is what is most likely to have been intentional by the biblical authors to enhance our understanding of the Bible. Most of the people that you're reading would have been trying to find something in the Bible that other people haven't seen. I doubt that there is something legitimately in the Bible that other people haven't seen. So I think that's where I would come from. So, any other questions?
You think that, I think this is still true, or still the case, or thought to be the case, about the writings of the New Testament, books of the books of the New Testament, since their origin for the most part is obviously subsequent to Paul's letters, they all would have been around, probably, not all of them, but I guess they all would have been condensed or written subsequent to the destruction of the temple. Sometimes people will use numbers to impart meaning that they're trying to mask a different audience, to communicate to people that they know, or that are their true audience, and at the same time are trying to protect themselves. So they might use, talk about poetry, but they might use language in their way.
I mean, so one of the early Christian examples of gematria would have been ichthus. So Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, spells out fish. And so that's how the fish became a symbol. So they could go make fishes, and other people wouldn't understand it. They would just think it was a fish on the wall. So I do think that there was a lot of trying to hide things and play around with things. You mentioned the destruction of the temple. Interesting thing I found, I never thought about. I didn't think it was solid enough to actually include in the presentation, but someone brought up the fact that the destruction of the temple, 70 AD, was about 40 years after Jesus predicted it. Because Jesus predicted it in about 30-ish AD. And he never says it's going to be 40, but this this idea that it's 40, 40, 40, historically it did happen about 40 years after he predicted it. Which is funny, because if you would think that the writers of the gospel would have put that in intentionally, added that, but they didn't. If they were trying to play up the completion thing. Yeah. Anyway, any other questions? Okay. I'm going to close this in prayer. Next week is Dr. Paul Sloan. He is excellent. He's a professor at HCU. And his entire career has been around Christian interpretations of the law. And so what he's going to be talking about next week is, the title is How to Read the Bible in a Way That Isn't Anti-Semitic. And his entire thesis is that Jesus was not nearly as anti-law as we are, that we're reading things into Jesus's interpretation that are not actually there. So I'm really interested to hear him speak next week. He's also going to be much better. Some of your questions that you asked, if you have not been satisfied with the answer, ask him. He's a fantastic professor, and I'm excited for what he has. Let's close in prayer. Almighty God, we're so grateful for the word that you've spoken to us, and we're so grateful for the gift that you've given us in your scriptures. God, we ask for minds to hear and hearts to understand, that as we go forward in learning and in deepening our faith, we might become more fully the children of God, equipped for the work of God in this world. This we pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.